The parables are these great stories that give us insight into the way that Jesus liked to teach and preach. In fact, sometimes I think we forget that these parables were stories told aloud to crowds of people. Jesus probably told the same story multiple times as he went about teaching and preaching. He may have even changed the details of the story to apply to the people he was speaking to. Because, of course, the purpose of Jesus telling these stories was for his hearers to learn something and to be moved by what he spoke. And then once people heard these parables and began to retell them, each person heard something different and remembered something differently. These stories were told for 40 to 60 years before they were recorded and written down in the Gospels as we see them today. And then with each gospel written, we can see the author's spin on the parable. They might emphasize a certain detail, add in a detail, or take out a detail, and not with malicious intent. It's just that the very nature of the parables, which were stories told aloud over a number of years in many places, leaves room for interpretation. These are living stories, just the way that Jesus intended them. The gospel writers, like many of us, didn't like the flexibility in interpretation inherent in the parables. They were human, after all, and were searching for a fixed meaning, as we tend to do. So we can't be assured of the historicity or the precision of detail in our parables. So like the first listeners of Jesus, we have to put ourselves in the story and try to figure out what is being said. And it's the practice of putting ourselves in the story, in the context, that is the practice that Jesus wanted to awaken in us. It's the acknowledgement that the story lives and moves and breathes that can help us in reading and understanding these parables. The parable of the talents, as our parable for today is so often called, has always been a hard one for me to hear. The way I've had this parable taught to me goes something like this. The talents given to the slaves in this story represent the talents, skills, or gifts given to each of us by God. So in this story, we are the slaves and God is the master. God gives to each of us unique talents represented by the differing amounts given to each slave. And some of us go into the world and use these talents to bring more glory to God, like the multiplying of the talents by the first and second slave. Those people will be praised for their work by the master. But some of us, like the third slave, will bury our talents, skills, and gifts in the ground, not using them in this world. On the day of judgment, God will be angry with us, so angry that he would take away the one talent given to us and give it to the one with more talents. The parable closes with these words from the master: "For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless third slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So in the way that I've been taught to read the parable, the worst thing you can do is to hide and to not use your God-given talents. For this, God will judge you harshly. And perhaps that is what's meant by this parable. Or perhaps this understanding of this parable as an allegory for the last judgment was something that arose much later in the life of this story, after it was recorded and read and studied by Christians for many years. What if there's another meaning that was intended by Jesus and heard by his first listeners? In Amy Jill Levine's book, Short Stories of Jesus, she includes this quote as a guide for reading the parables of Jesus. The quote is, "A text without a context is just a pretext for making the text say anything one wants." I'll repeat that. A text without a context is just a pretext for making the text say anything one wants. So what is the context of this parable? What kind of lives were the listeners of Jesus living that would affect the way they heard this story? What understandings might Jesus have intended in the telling of this story? When the parable was first told, the word talent, which is talenton in Greek, meant a specific weight or measurement of gold or silver, literally a specific amount of money. In fact, a very large sum of money in the time of Jesus, equal to about 6,000 denarii, and 1 denarius is what a normal day laborer would earn in a day of work. That's the value of 1 talent, 6,000 denarii. It is not until the late Middle Ages that we get the word talent as it is used in our English language today, meaning natural aptitude or skill. And interestingly enough, our word talent in the English language literally came from the allegorical reading of this parable, like I presented to you earlier. So we have to take a few steps back and erase our understanding of the word talent to hear what the listeners of Jesus would have heard. A talent is literally just a large sum of money in their hearing. The first slave in our story is given 5 talents, the second 2, and the third 1. So put yourselves in the shoes of Jesus' listeners, probably mostly day laborers, some merchants in Galilee and Judea, people to whom a talent is a very large sum of money, more money than some may see in a lifetime. So then they hear this story, and in the story, the first slave doubles the amount of money from 5 to 10 talents at the master's return. And the second slave also doubles the amount from 2 to 4. These people listening to the story knew the way that their economy worked. They knew the ways that people could make huge sums of money in a relatively short period of time. And this may have, and some scholars believe this is likely, this may have triggered in their brains this thought: is it through usury that the slaves made so much money so quickly? Usury was the practice of lending money or supplies with huge amounts of interest attached, oftentimes leading to the lendee owning all of what he owed to someone else. This practice was forbidden in Jewish law. In fact, the simple act of attaching any interest to any loan was forbidden between Jews. You were not supposed to profit off of another's loss or weakness. Usury was a way in the time of Jesus that those with deeper pockets, so to speak, could prey on those with less financial stability. Obviously something that we still see happening in our day. The listeners of Jesus, hearing the great sums of money the slaves had made on behalf of the master during his absence, they may not have looked at that as something to celebrate. They may have seen the first 2 slaves as contributing to the greedy, predatory, and also illegal practices of the master. In this hearing, the actions of the third slave take on a new meaning. For what does the third slave say when he comes before the master? "Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. And I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have back what is yours." The third slave may indeed be standing up to the predatory practices of the master and refusing to participate in a system that takes advantage of others. This is a very different parable now. When the parable is viewed through an economic lens of the first century, all of a sudden we hear in this parable a message that Jesus preached over and over, that we should not take advantage of those who are poorer, and in fact, that God is on the side of the poor, the weak, the disenfranchised. We don't have to jump through hoops to make this parable an allegory for the last judgment. We don't even have to make a new meaning for the word talent. The words of the master all of a sudden make sense. To those who have much, more will be given, and to those who have little, even that will be taken away. We might hear this saying today as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This was just a reality of the day, not a moral lesson that Jesus was trying to teach. And of course, in this parable, the master has the third slave thrown into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And why wouldn't the master throw this third slave onto the street where he will have to struggle to find food and work? Obviously, the master in this reading of the parable is not God. The master is just a human with human failings. The reality is that Jesus talked a lot about money in the parables. This one is not an outlier if we read it this way. And Jesus didn't talk about money because money is important in the eyes of God, but because Jesus knew the power that money holds over us. Money has to be talked about by Jesus because money can so easily become an idol, what we hold up as our standard for how well life is going. And it is amazing the mental gymnastics that we will do to avoid talking about money in the practice of Christianity today. Now, that's not completely true with Jim as our pastor. He does talk about money quite a bit. But this parable could be a good example of the mental gymnastics we do to not talk about money. This parable that was originally written about money and how we use money, all of a sudden through the history of Christianity became an allegory for the way God will judge us if we don't use our skills. So what can we learn from the reading of this parable as a parable about money? I think it's this, that money can be used for evil. Money can be used to prey on the weaker, the less financially stable. We need to pay attention to the systems that we participate in that are literally and figuratively built on the backs of others. We have to be aware of the times in our life when we are the master of this parable. We have to be aware as we enter this holiday season how our consumerism creates injustices all over the world. And not only to be aware of these systems, but to figure out a way how to not participate in those systems. And that's probably the hardest part, because in our American culture, we are embedded in these systems that create injustices for others because of the way we live and consume. We disenfranchise people within our own country and all over the world. So it may be impossible for us to get out of these systems that prey on the weak. But what things can we do to lessen our complicity, our participation in these systems? It's very interesting, the placement of this parable in the Gospels. In Luke, this parable is preceded by the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who decides to pay back those he defrauded 4 times, 4-fold. And then in Matthew, this parable is directly followed by a text that I think is truly a text of judgment from the mouth of Jesus. Matthew 25:31 goes like this. When the Son of Man comes in glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep and the goats. He will put the sheep on the right and the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on the right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. So do you remember how our parable started today? The kingdom of heaven is as if a master, going on a journey, and then the parable begins. So our parable is speaking to us about the kingdom of heaven. It's trying to explain to us some element of the kingdom. So perhaps the kingdom of heaven is made up of those who, like the third slave, step up to defend the disenfranchised, the least of these. The kingdom of heaven is made up of those who work on their behalf. Can we pray together? God, help us to know the ways that we use our money for evil, and help us to know the ways that we can use our money for good, because we realize that everything we have is yours and should work toward the building of your kingdom. Amen.